To continue our learning with the fifth chapter, which is concept and knowledge representation, here's the wrap up of the chapter. So, what are some of the major hypotheses regarding how knowledge is represented in mind? What are some of the characteristics of mental imagery? How does knowledge represent benefit from both images and propositions? And how many conceptual knowledge and experiences influence the way we use images? So, are the questions that we will be exploring in this chapter. So it's like helping the map of the city to be navigated by a blind person. So that is one of the examples that we can apply in having a concept and knowledge representation of things that we cannot really see. Okay, so I'll skip this activity. You can glance to it, okay, by quickly glancing at this figure for 10 seconds. Okay, let's proceed. So does it contain a parallelogram? So we'll know if you can remember. Okay, so next activity. Okay, so now we will be looking on the following images. So can mental images be ambiguous? Look at this figure A. So look closely at the rabbit, then cover it with your hand and recreate it in your mind. So can you see an animal in this image? Just may mentally shifting your perspective. So may iba ba kayong nakikitang animal dito sa specific image na to? So let's see. How about this? So what animal do you observe in this figure? So you can create a mental image of this figure and try to imagine the front end of this animal as the back end of another animal and the tail end of this animal as the front end of another animal. So meron ba kayong pwede maisip na specific animal at yung head ng animal na iniisip nyo ay yun naman yung magiging tail ng another animal na iisipin nyo? And lastly, so observe the animal in this figure. So, and create a mental image of that animal. So, ano animal ang nakikita nyo? So, try to interpret your mental image as a different kind of animal. Meron ba kayong naiisip na ibang animal? No? With that mental image? So, they could probably be looking or facing the same direction. So, let's proceed. Okay, so can mental images be ambiguous? So, when we say ambiguous, it's a sort of a vague, or we can never be specifically certain of what it is because of its obscurity and indistinctiveness. Okay? So nakita nyo ba? Meron ba kayong nakikitang ibang animal dyan sa figure A bukod sa rabbit? Dito sa letter B, yung tail end ba ng animal na nakita nyo ay pwede rin maging head ng another animal? At yung head ng unang animal na nakita nyo ay pwede rin ba maging tail? Lastly, no? So if you can think of a certain animal in this C, so meron pa ba kayong naiisip na iba pang kind ng animal na with similar head or similar figure or body as this one? Okay, so ambiguous figures. So ambiguous figures can be interpreted in more than one way. It is often used in studying of perception. So without looking back at the figure, so can you determine an alternative interpretation of the figure? So yun yung mga inask ko kanina. So how about this image or this figure? So what image or alternative images can you see aside from the first image that you have seen? Okay. So also we have this. So the alternative interpretation of a rabbit is a duck. In this interpretation, the rabbit's ears are the duck's bill. Would you agree? This is true to life image. This is not edited. Okay. So we have what we call the limitations of propositional theory. So the mental interpretation of ambiguous figures involves two manipulation. So first, we have what we call the mental realignment of the reference frame. So this realignment will involve a shift in positional orientation of the figures on the mental page or screen or which the image is displayed. So kung yung unang perspective niyo ay nakatuon kayo dun sa eyes and then it formed the image as a rabbit, but if you look in the ears as first part of the image, then you would see it as a beak of a duck. Okay? So we also have what we call the mental reconstrual or the interpretation parts of the figure. So kapag hindi nyo nakita yung rabbit, hindi nyo nakita yung duck, and meron kayong nakitang ibang image, so that is called mental reconstrual or interpretation of the parts of the image. Baka may ibang nakita pa ng image doon, no? Mas bizarre na type ng figure or image ang kanilang nakita. How about this image? Anong nakikita natin? Okay? So, also to continue, across experiments, 20% to 83% of participants were able to reinterpret ambiguous figures using one or more of the following hints. So, paano daw nila na-figure out yung mga figures with the hints? So, first, we have the implicit reference frame hint. So, participants were shown another ambiguous figure involving realignment of the reference frame. Example, yung hawk's head or yung ulo ng lawit, no, is also a goose tail or buntot ng gansa. And the hawk's tail could be a goose head. So, similar dun sa image B kanina, yung katabi ng rabbit. Next, we have what we call the explicit reference frame hint. So participants were asked to modify the reference frame by considering either the back of the head of the animal. So they had already seen as the front of the head as some of the other animal, no? So the front of the thing you were seeing as the back of something else. So that is the abstract hint. Also, we have what we call the attentional hint. So participants were directed to attend to the regions of the figure where realignments or reconstruals were to occur. So titignan lang yung specific parts kung saan yung pwedeng may changes sa realignment. Or kapag reconstructed yung image sa kanilang brain, tingnan nila. No? And last, we have construal from good parts. So participants were asked to construe an image from parts determined to be good. No? So according to the objective, geometrical, and empirical criteria rather than to be bad. So what could be a good part of the image? So probably the head itself. Because kahit pagpalitin yung head nung rabbit or duck, it's still a head. No? So also, with yung flying bird kanina, no? Kahit pagbalik rin sila, na ulo ng lawin pala yung kabila at ulo ng gansa yung kabila, no? The body and the wings remain. Okay, additionally, some spontaneous interpretation of mental images for ambiguous figure may occur. This is particularly likely for images of figures that may be reinterpreted without realigning the reference or the frame. So, pwedeng magkaroon ng spontaneous interpretation. Or, for example, yung nakita natin kanina, hindi natin ma-interpret na duck or rabbit, no? At mag-reinterpret tayo ng another image aside from that, no? Baka may makita tayong duwende, mga ganun, and the like. So, and the figure C, which may be a whole snail, or an elephant's head, or possibly even a bird, a helmet, a leaf, or a seashell. So, that is some of the examples of spontaneous interpretation. So, you can go back to the video para makita nyo. Kung nakita nyo ba ito ay as elephant head, as a bird, as a helmet, as a leaf, or a seashell. Okay. So, now we would be going to the influence of semantic levels. Visual images can be distorted through verbal information. Would you agree? So participants were asked to view figures that were labeled. When they recalled the image, they were distorted in the direction of the meaning of the image. So semantic or verbal information tends to distort a recall of visual image in the direction of the meanings of the images. Recall differs based on the differing labels given to the figures. For example, we can also see this type of semantics and different interpretations in conversation. You can look at this image. Do you want me to get you a taxi or tell you you're a taxi? So, ang reply niya is, call me a taxi, please. So, that could be either or could be neither nor. Okay? So, you also have the influence of the semantic levels in graphical examples. So, here, if you could see, no? You have here the reproduced figure. You have here the verbal levels, the stimulus figures, and some other verbal labels rather, with its reproduced figures. Kung makita nyo dito, we have curtains in the window, Stimulus figures, diamond in a rectangle. So that's what you will see. No? Kasi nagkaroon ng tinatawag na verbal label. Like, iba yung verbal label, so yun na yung nakikita ninyo. For example, it's 7, no? Pero may nagsabi na ang label niya ay 4. So makita natin yung pagka-4 niya. Here, we will see a ship's wheel, no? And this is a stimulus figure and someone says it's a table. Then you'll see the table. The kidney bean and the canoe. You have here the pine tree and the trowel. The gun with different verbal label. It was looked upon as a broom. The 2 could be looked on 8 if there would be a different verbal labels. Kapag nagbago yung label, no, pwede mag-change yung interpretation natin. Kaya minsan, malaki ang impact ng label. Okay. So although visual imagery is not identical to visual perception, it is functionally equivalent to it. Okay? So functionally equivalent things are strongly analogous. So they can accomplish the same goals. So this view essentially suggests that we use images rather than propositions in knowledge, representations for concrete objects that can be pictured in mind. So minsan daw mas mahalaga or rather mas malakas ang impact ng visual images rather than semantics and proposition through words. Because it could be made into different meaning or there would be an ambiguity. For example, here in the picture, I saw her duck, no? So, kapag wala tayong visual image, it could be of different interpretation. So, like the first picture, the girl ducks from a flying soccer ball. And the second picture, so we can see here, a girl or a woman with her duck. But we can use the same semantics, I saw her duck. Okay, now we would go to the mental manipulations of images. Okay, so kung babalikan natin yung definition kanina, this is called functional equivalence hypothesis. So although visual imagery is not identical to visual perception, it is functionally equivalent to it. So this is another example. So functionally equivalent things are strongly analogous to each other, so they can accomplish the same goals. So the chicken is ready to eat. So this view essentially suggests that we use images rather than proposition in knowledge representation for concrete objects that can be pictured in mind. Parang kung may different way of saying things, no? Di ko alam kung saang part ng Philippines yun, tatanungin ka nila, nakain ka na ganang pating? So, ang kanilang tinatanong ay kung nakakain ka na or nakatingin ka na ng pating. Pero kapag ikaw ay puro Tagalog or titigan mong mabuti kung paano sinabing salita, nakain ka na ganang pating? It's a little bit in the position of the shark eating you, no? Like here, the chicken is ready to eat. It can be of two definitions. Okay? So, principle of visual imagery continued. According to the functional equivalence, no? Tuloy pa rin natin yun. Yun nga, we represent the use of visual imagery in a way that is functionally equivalent to for to that for physical percepts. So Ronald Fink has suggested several principles of visual imagery that may be used to guide research and theory development. So these are the principles of visual imagery. Sinasabi dito that our mental transformations of image in our mental movements across image correspond to those of physical objects and percepts. Depende sa perspective na tinitingnan natin, magkakaroon ng changes. So the spatial relation among elements of visual image are analogous to those relation in actual physical space. No? They are almost similar. Mental images can be used to generate information that was not explicitly stored during encoding. So, meron tayong makikita mga other parts na on the first place or at first glance na nakita natin image, hindi natin sila agad mapapansin. The construction of mental image is analogous to the construction of visually perceptible figures. So, visual imagery is functionally equivalent to visual perception in terms of the processes of the visual system used for each. So we can apply this such experience such as when we are looking for something. So nakita mo ba kaninang may hawak akong cellphone? So ngayon i-recall mo. Though hindi ka very much aware, no? Try mong i-recall yung instance or yung circumstance a while ago. No, wherein nagkikreate ka ng sarili mo visual image. Wala akong naalala, no? na may hawak kang cellphone, parang ganun. So we tend to reconstruct a situation, an event, or an image. Next, we would look on neuroscience and its functional equivalence. So schizophrenia provides an interesting example of similarities between perception and imagery. As we all know, schizophrenia itself is a term that is used generally for uh, term for terms such as in Tagalog, baliw. No? Also, schizophrenia has its own symptoms and criteria to be diagnosed as such. So we have here what we call the delusions and hallucinations. If we would look in auditory hallucination or auditory hallucination that are experienced of hearing that occur in absence of actual auditory stimuli, it could be an functional equivalence. So evidence from other research reveals that during auditory hallucinations, there are abnormal activations of the auditory cortex. So nagkakaroon ng brain activity sa kanyang auditory cortex in his or her temporal lobe. In some, it is believed that auditory hallucinations occur at least in part because of malfunctions of auditory imaging system and problematic perception processes. So these results suggest that there are or is indeed functional equivalence between what our senses perceive and what we create in our minds. That's why, no, kung babalikan natin yung unang-unang discussion nito, imagery is not only in visual form, no? It can be connected to our sensory or senses, no? We can rethink of what a specific food tastes. We can rethink of what a specific perfume smell, no? And the like. So now we would look on mental rotation. So it involves rotationally transforming an object's visual mental image. So we would see the object and we will manually or we will try to imitate the object in our head and visually rotate it into a transformed object. So as you can see here, we have here the zebra. But kahit hindi natin nakikita yung image dun sa right side niya, we can rotate the zebra in our mind or in our mental image. So usually itong mga types ng test na to ay nakikita sa mga different types of psychological test. Intelligence test, no? Pati mga entrance examinations ng other schools, meron to. Abstract reasoning. So for which these pairs of figures, thus figure on the right, show an accurate rotation of the figure on the left. So saan sa tingin nyo ang tamang sagot dyan? Yung A, or yung B, or yung C? No? So saan sa kanila yung figure na pinapakita accurately yung tamang rotation ng left? No? Yung iba dyan sa image, no, kapag nag-rotate, hindi na same dun sa image sa right. Nag-iba ng image. Pero may isa dyan na tama. Okay, so the firms were rotated 0 to 180 degrees. So we have here what we call a picture plane, 2D space clockwise or counterclockwise. We can see its depth in 3D space and it has its own destructor form. So there is no significant difference between rotations in the picture plane and rotations in depth, actually. So to rotate objects at larger angles of rotation takes longer. Mental rotation may be an automatic process. Such automatic process may be a sign of more effective visual spatial skills because increased speed is associated with increased accuracy and spatial memory. So itong image sa taas, saan yung tamang rotation dyan? Tingnan nga natin. Itong image sa baba, saan yung tamang pag-rotate dyan? Can you identify? Okay. So, intelligence and mental rotation. Primary mental abilities test of Louise and Thelma Thurstone requires mental rotation of two-dimensionally pictured objects in a picture plane. So it is identify the mental representations and cognitive process that underlie adaptations to the environment and thus ultimately that constitute human intelligence. So nagamit nila itong mental rotation, brain imaging, para makatulong sa pag-identify ng intelligence ng isang individual. Also, we would look upon the connection of neuroscience and mental rotation. Mental rotation also indicates that the motor cortex is activated during this task. These areas is associated with hand movements that were particularly active during the mental rotation tasks. No? If you can see, someone or some of you may be imitating the rotation of the image. Areas of the cerebral cortex have representations that resemble to 2D spatial arrangement of visual receptors on the retina of the eye. So these mappings may be construed as relatively depictive of the visual arrays of the real world. Okay, to understand this statement, no, meron daw tayong 2D spatial arrangements as in visual receptors or the eyes, no? But in our cerebral cortex, may specific area doon na kaya mag-construct or reconstruct, no, ng mga images na yon para mas makita natin yung depth ng real world. So the same brain areas involved in perception are also involved in mental rotation tasks. Okay. So ngayon naman titignan naman natin yung connection ng gender sa ating mental rotation. In young children daw, there is no gender differences either in performance or neurological activation. But there seem to have differences in the activation of the parietal region between men and women. There is less parietal activation daw for women than for men in completing the same mental rotation tasks. So, mas madaming parietal activation or dun sa parietal lobe. In women, spatial tasks involve both sides of the brain, whereas in men, the right side dominates this function. The difference in brain activation may mean that men and women use different strategies to solve mental rotation problems. Women though have proportionally greater amount of gray matter in the parietal lobe than do in men, which is associated with performance disadvantage for mental rotation task for women. Okay, because they need an increased effort to complete the task. So nakita nyo ba yung image dyan sa taas? So is the girl rotating in right side, in clockwise or counterclockwise? Pakanan ba yung ikot niya or pakaliwa? Try looking in different perspectives and you'll see. So we also have what we called here the image scaling or zooming in on mental images. So we use mental image the same way we use our actual perception. So when you look at a building from afar, you won't be able to see as many details as when you are close by, and you may not be able to see things as clearly. In general, seeing details though of large objects is easier than seeing such details of small ones. We respond more quickly to questions about large objects and we observe than to question about the small ones we observe. Or ulitin natin yun. We respond more quickly to questions about large objects we observe than to question about small ones we observe. Mas madali daw natin masagot or ma-identify yung details kapag large objects ang ating reference rather than small ones. Now we would be talking about image scanning. So let's go back in the image scaling or zooming in on details. So tignan mabuti ang image na to. We have here the rabbit beside the fly, right? Okay. Look at that rabbit and fly the figure. Now, no, try nyo isipin yung picture na yun sa inyong mind. Now, in your imagination, look only at the fly and determine the exact shape of the fly's head. So, na-notice nyo ba na meron kayong parang zooming effect to see the detailed features of the fly? So, when looking at the fly, na-identify nyo saan doon yung mata niya, saan doon yung pakpak, saan doon yung itsura ng katawan niya, yung mga paa niya na may mga buhok. So if you're like most people, you are able to zoom in on your mental image to give the features or objects a large portion of your mental screen. Much as you might physically move toward an object you want to observe more closely. So now, let us look on this. A rabbit beside the elephant. So it's the same rabbit as the one in the previous PowerPoint. Natandaan na ba yung image? So now look at that rabbit and the elephant in the picture and picture them both in your mind. So close your eyes and look at the elephant. Imagine walking towards that elephant, watching it as it gets closer to you. You find that there comes a point when you can no longer see the rabbit or even all of the elephant. If you're like most people, you will find that the image of the elephant will appear to overflow the size of your image space. So yung perspective nyo, no, lumalagpas yung itsurang elephant kapag palapit na kayo ng palapit. To see the whole elephant, you probably have to mentally zoom out again. Amazing, right? Okay, now we would now try to picture this imaginary island. So this imaginary island is a fictitious map used by Kozlo et al. In 1978 to determine differences in processing time relative to the distance between image to be recalled. Subjects have to commit this map to memory, then mentally scan from point to point in the map. So, for example, let's try. So, pwede bang tingnan natin mabuti yung features ng map? Okay. Now, before proceeding to this perspective, can you identify specific places that you have seen in the map? For example, the well, the hut, the lake. Can you still remember where you can find the coconut tree? Can you still remember where you can see the stones? So, okay, let's proceed. So we have what we call a representational neglect. So a person asked to imagine a scene and then describe it ignores half of the imagined scene. So it's similar to the island that you look upon. So maaalala nyo siguro yung island pero not 100% of the details. So ini-imagine nyo siya or ini-imagine yung scene, no? Pero hindi yung kumpletong scene ang nakikita ninyo sa inyong isip. Same as this image, no? Pinapaisip sa kanya yung specific building, no? Pero hindi niya nakikita yung kabuuan. Ang nakikita niya lang yung sa labas, and hindi rin siya sobrang clear sa kanyang isip. So now we will proceed to synthesizing images and prepositions. So we have what we call the Johnson-Laird's mental models. So mental models are knowledge structures that individuals construct to understand and explain their experiences. So titignan nila yung kanilang own perspective regarding these specific models. For example, we have here the blind man that describes an elephant from an old Indian fable. So yung isang blind man, nahawakan niya yung trunk, sabi niya, this is a snake. So yung isang blind man, nahawakan niya yung feet, this is a tree, as to her description. Yung isa naman, napunta sa kanyang tummy, sa ilalim, sabi niya, this is a cave. Yung isa, nahawakan niya yung buntot at sinabi niya, this is a branch. Isa, umaakit siya sa kanyang sa lower back ng elephant, said that this is a high mountain. The other one touches the ears of the elephant, on the top of the elephant, and says that it is a faded leaf. Also, when one is looking upon or describing the iceberg method of Carl Jung, they could have the representations of iceberg in their mind if they are very particular to the image representation, but they can have their own representation of ice cubes in a glass because that is their mental models. So, the left brain or the right brain, where is information manipulated? Saan nga ba? Sa left or sa right? What do you think? According here, so the right hemisphere appears to represent and manipulate the visual and spatial knowledge in a manner similar to perception. Also, it represents knowledge in a manner that is analogous to our physical environment. So, yung right side daw usually, ang nagmamanipulate ng visual spatial knowledge. Yung left hemisphere naman, they appear to be more proficient in representing and manipulating verbal and other symbol-based knowledge. Dito yung merong specific guide, no? Yung merong specific words or specific numbers or specific symbols. Also, it has the ability to manipulate imaginal components and symbols and to generate entirely new information. So, for example, nag-iisip kayo ng bagong piyesa sa motor ninyo, no? Sa left side ng brain yun, gumagana. Kasi nai-imagine nyo yung motor niyo at nilalagay nyo yung panibagong pyesa or panibagong modification. However, kapag visual spatial knowledge, no? Kapag magka-create kayo ng something, wala pang existing object, no? Iisipin nyo, magki-create ako ng project, no? Ano ba yung gusto kong gawing project? Gagawa ko ng barko. Parang ganun. So, it's a visual spatial knowledge, hindi pa existing yung object. Magki-create pa lang kayo. So we have two kinds of image, visual versus spatial. The visual imagery refers though to the use of images that represent visual characteristics such as colors and shapes. So we can think of red square, blue pentagon. How about spatial imagery? Spatial imagery refers to images that represent spatial features such as depth, dimension, distance, and orientation. For example, we would identify, so how can we go to the market? First, we would go left to the department store, then go right to this specific place. So it's more three-dimensional, no? And the distance can also be an example here. So, gaano kalayo yung ganito? Usually, gaano kalayo? Ang reply nga natin minsan ay oras. Mga 30-minute walk, parang ganun. Gaano kalayo yung gaano kalayo yung boarding house mo mula sa palengke? Ang sasabihin natin, based on our spatial imagery, mga lang, mga 15-minute walk lang, no? Hindi yung specific distance ang sinasabi natin. We use our spatial imagery. Have you tried that? Do you have any examples regarding that? Okay, so spatial cognition and cognitive maps. So this is the last part. Spatial cognition deals with the acquisition, organization, and the use of knowledge about objects and actions in 2 or 3-dimensional space. So ina-acquire natin, no? Ina-organize natin, at ginagamit natin yung knowledge, no? In real life, in real time, sa ating isip. So cognitive maps are internal representations of our physical environment, particularly centering on spatial relationships. So titignan natin dito yung mga internal representation. No, kapag iniisip natin yung paghahanap sa location sa isang lugar, so anong part ng ating brain kaya yung gumagana? So titignan natin, nagkakaroon tayo ng internal representation, no? Meron tayong tinatawag na cognitive map, no? Okay, so ganito yung lugar na yun. Doon sa bahay ko, bandang kaliwa nun, merong table. Doon sa kanan, may nakalagay na ganito. Sa ilalim ng higaan, may ganyan. That is one of the ways that we can use our cognitive maps. For example, when locating a place or a rendezvous point, no? Sir, para makapunta po kayo sa ganitong lugar, kailangan nyo po munang pumunta doon. Kapag may makita po kayong poste na kulay dilaw, hindi pa po yun. Diretso pa po kayo. Parang mga ganun, no? Those are cognitive maps. Oh, rats. So, if you are familiar with Edward Tolman, he is one of the educational psychologists that studied on rats and on rat mazes. No, experimental psychologist siya. He argued for the importance of mental representation that gives rise to a behavior, so the ability of rats to learn a maze. Sabi niya na may factor daw yung mental representation sa behavior ng rat. So, paano yung behavior? Paano natin ma-connect yun? For example, hungry yung rat and merong specific smell na naamoy siya ng specific food. So, paano niya malolocate yun? No? With the hunger itself, no, yung behavior niya nag-change, kailangan for survival, no? Nag-create siya ng sarili niyang cognitive map para mahanap yun using his or her senses. Also, nagamit din yung bees or yung mga bubuyog. So, bees, as an example, has a Nobel Prize winning German scientist. So, siya yung okay. So, hindi ko nilagay dito yung pangalan German scientist, but the German scientist is Karl von Frisch. Karl space VON space FRISCH. Okay. So, again, they studied the behavior of bees when they returned to their hive after having located a source of nectar. So, imagine nyo, sa lawak ng sinasakop ng mga bubuyog para maghanap ng nectars ng flower, nakakabalik sila sa kanilang hive, no? Para mag-create ng honey for food. How about pigeons, no? Familiar ba kayo dito sa mga pigeons or sa mga kalapate? Pigeons and doves, no? So they are noted for their excellent cognitive maps. So these birds are known for their ability to return to their home from distant location, no? Meron ba kayong kilalang nagpapalipad ng kalapate, no? Pupunta sa ibang bayan, magpapalipad ng kalapate, tapos hihintayin makauwi yung kalapate sa kanilang mga lugar? Okay. So how about in human? So hippocampus is involved in the formation of cognitive maps in human. So left hippocampus plays a pivotal role in map formation, also crucial for perception of landmarks within the environment. Right hippocampus is involved in sensitivity to global features of the environment. So kaya rin naman yun ng tao, no? At syempre, since tayo ang highest form of being, so ayan. So, yun nga, nakakapag-create tayo ng tinatawag nating mental maps or cognitive maps, no? Para malocate yung isang lugar or yung direction. For example, meron tayong specific landmarks. Ay, nadaanan ko itong punong to eh. Malapit na tayo doon. Ay, doon ang bahay nila sa, sa putol na daan or may putol na tulay. Meron tayong mga ganong landmarks. So, humans seem to use three types of knowledge daw when forming and using cognitive maps. Tulad ng nabanggit natin kanina, first we have what we call the landmark knowledge. It is the information about particular features at a location and which may be based on both imaginal and propositional representation. So, do you have any example of landmark knowledge? We also have what we call we have here the route road knowledge or route road knowledge. So it involves specific pathways for moving from one location to another. It may be based on both positional knowledge and declarative knowledge. If you could remember positional knowledge, ito yung knowledge na may specific procedures na yung ang example natin is yung pag-drive ng motor, paano sinisimulan. And declarative knowledge, these are knowledge based on facts or specific experience, no? Merong specific proof. For example, nakadaan na tayo dito dati, no? Meron tayong memory of that. And we also have what we call the survey knowledge, which involves estimated distances between landmarks, much as they might appear on survey maps. It may be represented imaginally or propositionally. Tulad ng example natin na gaano kalayo yung papunta sa isang lugar. Or for example, ang bahay namin papunta sa palengke ay 1 kilometer, sabi sa aking watch, sa aking monitor. Pero kung isipin ko kung gaano katagal yun, pwede kong sabihin na ang distance ng bahay namin papunta sa market ay nasa 15 minutes, no? Meron tayong ibang representations. Okay? So we have what we call the rules of thumb for using mental maps. So tandaan natin itong mga rules of thumb na to para hindi tayo mahirapan kapag naglo-locate tayo ng specific lugar, no, point, or kapag tayo ay pupunta sa isang lugar na hindi tayo very much familiar. For example, pupunta tayo sa PRC, no? Mag-aayos kayo ng lisensya nyo sa psychometrician sa future, or pupunta tayo sa Manila sa isang convention, no? Kailangan natin tandaan itong mga rules of thumb sa paggamit ng cognitive maps. So, ang tawag dito ay heuristics. So, when we use landmark, route road, and survey knowledge, we sometimes use rules of the thumb that influence our estimations of the distance. These rules of thumb are cognitive strategies termed heuristics. So, this allows people to solve problems and make judgment quickly and efficiently. But they are also prone to error. So, bakit kaya, no? They can make judgment quickly and efficiently. For example, isa sa mga questions, saan tayo kakain? No? Kahit saan. Pero kapag ikaw magde-decide, no? With your heuristic way of cognitive strategy, sabihin mo, doon na lang tayo sa malapit, sa Jollibee. No? Sasabihin nung kasama mo, ay, ayoko doon, may ganito. Tapos kapag mamili ka ng ibang lugar, meron ding ibang reklamo. No? Ay, ayoko doon, ganito. So, it could be one of the error. So these are the error. So right angle bias. So people tend to think of intersection or street crossing as forming 90-degree angle more often than our intersection really do. No? Iniisip natin na ang intersection daw ay laging right angle or straight, no? Diretso, kanan, liko, ganyan. Wherein kung titingnan natin in reality, meron tong mga parang curvature, paliko talaga, no? Diretso-diretso lang. Yung sinasabi natin dire-diretso lang yung daan, we particularly tend to move along the way of the road. Pero hindi siya particularly na dire-diretso lang. Kasi kapag dire-diretso, no, such as the right angle bias, babangga tayo. No? Or street crossing itself. No? We also have what we call the symmetry heuristic. People tend to think of shapes, states, or countries as being more symmetrical than they really are. For example, yung mga daan sa, for example, sasabihin natin, yung mga daan sa loob ng SBMA, very symmetrical. No? Pero kung isipin, hindi. No? Ang daming liko-liko, ang daming mga hindi pantay-pantay, ang daming lalagpas ka dito, papasok ka sa ganyan. No? So, pero meron tayong ganitong heuristic symmetry na nasa ating cognitive way of thinking. We also have what we call the rotation heuristic. When representing a figure and boundaries that are slightly slanted or oblique, people tend to distort the image as being either more vertical or more horizontal than they really are. No? Kung it's a little bit boundaries or slanted, paliko, iniisip natin siya as more vertical and more horizontal than they really are. No? Yung mga tinatawag nating zigzag roads, they are zigzag in their main image, pero kapag sinabi natin minsan yung words in a manner, sabihin natin, dire-diretsuhin mo lang yung zigzag. Where in fact, hindi naman dire-diretso ang zigzag. No? Nagigets niyo ba yung rotation heuristic? So again, kapag right angle bias, iniisip natin na laging 90 degrees yung angle sa mga lugar. Yung mga crossing, yung mga intersection, inisip natin as 90 degrees. Pero hindi naman talaga completely 90 degree lahat ng yon. We also have the symmetry heuristic, no? We tend to think of shapes as being more symmetrical than they really are, no? Pero ito kasi yung way natin para makapag-efficiently think at mas madaling makapag-decide kung tayo ba ay dediretso, liliko, kakanan, no? Or kakaliwa. And lastly, the rotation heuristic, as we said a while ago, no? We represent figures and boundaries that are slightly slanted or oblique, no? As something more vertical and horizontal. no? Yung distorted na lugar na daanan, pinaportray natin siya as horizontal or dire-diretso lang, no? Yung kaya nga ang example ko kanina, dire-diretsuhin mo lang yung zigzag, no? Which is kung titingnan natin literally in a way, no, mali yun. Also, we have here the alignment heuristic. So, bakit alignment heuristic? People tend to represent landmarks and boundaries that are slightly out of alignment by distorting the mental image to be better aligned that they really are. No? For example, as you can see here, this is the Santo Niño Church in Mapanuepe Lake. Kung titingnan natin siya in closer perspective, hindi na siya ganun kadiretso, no? The relative position of particular landmarks and boundaries is distorted in mental image in ways that more accurately reflects people's conceptual knowledge about context in which the landmarks and boundaries are located rather than reflecting the actual spatial configuration. Probably dito sa image natin, nagkaroon lang ng distortion sa way na nire-represent yung picture sa baba. So, paano natin naiintindihan? For example, ulit, tingnan natin itong Santo Niño Church dito sa Mapanuepe Lake sa San Marcelino. So, kung titignan natin dyan, kung paano siya pinicturean, very straight yan. Pero kapag pupunta ka near it, no, merong a little bit changes at hindi na ganun ka-straight yung kanyang elevation sa ground because of the changes in the soil. No? Pero based on the images and concepts na alam natin sa mga pictures, no, sa ating images, sa ating galleries, no, diretsong-diretso pa rin siya. Pero possibly meron lang changes yung mga landmarks na alam natin, na hindi lang natin gano'n napapansin directly. Nakapunta na ba kayo dyan sa Mapanuepe Lake? Ako hindi pa. And lastly, sometimes, to get between places, we need to imagine the route we will need to traverse rather. No? For example, may specific part ng route na hindi natin madadaanan, pero meron tayong mga shortcuts or mental images na pwede nating lusutan, no, para makapunta tayo doon. For example, dito sa nakita natin, isang map, no, ng isang popular na laro, which is Pokemon, no, merong mga specific lugar dyan na hindi mo pa mapupuntahan dahil may mga block, no. Pero you can go around that through different ways, such as, for example, merong lugar na pwede kang paghukayan, no? May lugar na pwede kang pag-akyatan para mapuntahan mo yung mga lugar na yon. Thus, our imagery abilities are potential keys to our survival and to what makes us intelligent in our everyday lives. So that would be all, and I hope you have additional take for this second part. Thank you.